The following recording is a program of the World War I Historical Association. This special ongoing series commemorates the centennial of the First World War.
This is Dana Lombardi for the World War I Historical Association. On October 2nd and 3rd of 2015, a Collaboration Symposium was held between the WW1HA and the League of World War I Aviation Historians. This series presents the seminars offered at that symposium.
Good morning. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of familiar ground coming up here, but I'll try not to overdo that. Well, for those who are not members of the League, there might be something new here, but it just so happens that we are having the centennial of the fighter plane this year, which isn't to say that there wasn't combat before then, as I shall describe. We're actually going to be covering it from two different angles, literally. I've been asked to cover the Allies, while Lance Bronnenkamp is going to be taking care of the German side. We'll see which one is more familiar to you. Speaking of unfamiliar, the opening picture here is one of those rare early color photographs from World War I of what was one of the more powerful French aircraft of actually early 1916, the Nieuport 16, demonstrating one example of the Allied armament I'll be covering, the Lewis machine gun mounted above the upper wing. The pilot is Jean Schulte, who had earlier scored his first victories in Caudron G3 and G4 reconnaissance planes before he got into a Nieuport, and among his victories in that would be a Fokker E3. And he would go on to get a total of 16 before he was killed in action in 1918.
Pointed at the laptop. No, at the laptop. Oh, that worked. That worked.
Oh. Now, prior to by the start of World War I, the airplane had already been taken seriously. In fact, aircraft had been used in warfare since 1795, if you count balloons, and for real-time artillery spotting since September 1861, when a balloon at Falls Church was telegraphing particulars of a Confederate battery to Union artillery just outside Washington, D.C. The airplane had been used in war over Libya by the Italians and had been used by all sides, including the Turks, during the two Balkan Wars of 1912 to 13. So by the time World War I began, there were still a few highly conservative skeptics, but there wouldn't be too many left after September 1914, when Louis Breguet and his observer found evidence to confirm that General von Kluck's First Army had changed direction along the Marne, bringing on the Battle of the Marne, which changed the whole course of World War I, initiated trench warfare, and above all, gave everyone reason to take the airplane seriously. From that time on, in fact, even one could argue before that time, the two sides were considering the idea of denying such eyes in the sky to the other side. Initially, in fact, as early as the Balkan Wars, Bulgarians and Serbs who had trained together in France would run into each other in the Second Balkan War and wave to each other as they went by because they didn't know what else to do. And besides, they knew each other, even though they were now enemies, unlike in the First Balkan War when they'd been allies. But who was the first to shoot down an enemy plane is much in dispute. One of the candidates is Lieutenant Hubert Harvey Kelly, a Northern Irishman who'd come in with the first British Royal Flying Corps contingent. He is shown at the bottom of the haystack smoking a cigarette dangerously close to both the haystack and his PE-2A. On August 25th, 1914, he and his observer attacked a German Taube monoplane with their pistols. The shocked Germans fluttered to earth, abandoned their plane, and ran into the woods with the Brits in hot pursuit, but they couldn't catch them. So they went back, gathered some souvenirs, and set fire to the Taube, and then took off back to British lines. So that's Britain's claim. Needless to say, the Russians claim their own. And in fact, the man who had that distinction was Stabskapitan Pyotr Nikolaevich Nesterov, who had earlier gained some fame or notoriety when he became the first man to do what he called a death loop, flying his looping his plane in the air on September 14th, 1913, for which he was jailed for endangering government property. He then, but on September 21st, French aviator Adolphe Pégoud did a loop of his own and became the toast of Europe, at which point the Russians reconsidered and freed Nesterov and, of course, said what they would so often say, "You invented in Russia first," and made Nesterov not only a hero, but when war broke out, gave him the command of his own squadron, the 11th, which was serving in Galicia in September 1914, when a loaner biplane of Austro-Hungarian Flieger Company 11, based at Zurowica, came over and bombed his aerodrome. The observer, Oberleutnant Friedrich Freiherr Rosenthal, owned several estates in the area, so this might have been a grudge match here. He reappeared over Zholkov the next morning. Nesterov, who had advocated the idea, and I quote, and this was before the war, "I am perfectly convinced that it is the duty of every military aviator to be able to execute looping flights and gliding flights. These exercises must certainly be included in the training program, as they will play a great part in the aero combat. Such a combat will resemble a fight between a hawk and a crow. The aviator who is able to give his craft the mobility and flexibility of motion of the hawk will be in a better position to seriously damage his opponent." Well, Nesterov went up, fired at the Austrians, and failed to accomplish anything. Later that same day, September 8th, Rosenthal appeared again. At this point, Nesterov jumped into his Moran Saulnier G without bothering to fasten his seatbelt, and when one of his men came to offer a Browning pistol, Nesterov said, "That's all right, I shall manage without it." He climbed above the loaner, went into a dive, and rammed it. It is believed that he was trying to do what Russians would later do in World War II, what they would call a taran, to try and use his propeller to damage his opponent, but it didn't work out that way. His plane became entangled in the Austrian, and he was thrown out as it spun down to earth. He was killed, Oberleutnant Rosenthal was killed, and so was his pilot, Feldwebel František Malina. And the Russians, of course, honored their hero for the first aerial victory of World War I, later named a town after him. There was another claimant to the first victory, but only after the war, and that was Günter Plüschow, the entire German air service in China. He and his Rumpler Taube were single-handedly taking on the Japanese combined naval and army air forces, all 10 of them, that were in turn systematically out to eliminate that pesky Taube that was observing their siege of the German concession of Tsingtao. Now, they would often bomb his airfield and even see the plane destroyed, only to find that Taube flying over them the next day, unaware of the fact that Plüschow had had the innovative idea of creating bamboo dummies of his plane, putting them prominently on the airfield while hiding his in a nearby cave. On September 28th, Plüschow claimed in retrospect he attacked a Japanese fireman, an MF-11, similar to the one that you saw referenced with Capitan Appa's MF-29, and he claimed he brought it down. Intriguingly, the Japanese acknowledged the death of a lieutenant who was an aviator of theirs at about that same time. It's a little vague beyond that. This is just as well as far as Plüschow was concerned, because he never put in for the victory and never claimed it until after the war, for a simple reason. The Governor General Tsingtao had given him specific orders to avoid any Japanese aircraft at all costs, because he didn't want to risk his entire air force. These were not open to debate. This was a specific order, and in attacking that Japanese plane, Plüschow had committed a court-martial offense. So we'll never know for sure, will we? Plüschow actually was still flying when Tsingtao fell on November 6, 1914. The Governor General gave him all the papers that he could possibly compile with orders to get them out of the colony before he surrendered. Plüschow flew as far as he could before his plane crash landed. He sold it and its engine to a local Chinese mandarin and started out on a Indiana Jones type adventure that would carry him all the way over the world, captured by the British, escape, and eventually back to Germany. That's a story in itself, but I digress. The first shoot down of a plane without sacrificing the pilot was credited to a pair of Frenchmen. Sergeant Joseph France and Soldat Louis Queneau of Escadrille V-24. They were flying in a Voisin 3LA pusher on October 5th, 1915, when they encountered an Aviatique B-1 over Reims. The Germans fired at them with their rifles and carbines. The French at this point had a Hotchkiss machine gun mounted on the front of their Voisin, which Queneau fired at the Germans. In fact, he fired both clips of ammunition and failed to accomplish anything. At that point, with the Germans shooting at them, both Frenchmen took out their carbines, fired back, and it was just a case, I suppose, of one of them getting lucky, because the Aviatique went down, killing Sergeant Wilhelm Schilling and Oberleutnant Fritz-Panzangen of Feldfliegerabteilung 18. A genuine victory there. So about that time, it became very common for both sides to start figuring out how to get an edge in the air. Pusher aircraft seemed to be the way to go because you had the most, at a time when everyone was using flexible machine guns, it seemed like the way to get the best vistas. In fact, one of the first Belgian ace of the war, Fernand Jacquet, who was nearsighted as almost a bat, and yet was incredibly aggressive. He flew a Farman MF-11 similar to the, as a matter of fact, that is the one he flew, decorated with the skull on the nacelle, and relied on a good gunner as he would fly into German lines and then come around, and as Germans would be returning from their reconnaissances thinking they were safe, for 5 of them, the last thing they ever saw was that grinning skull as Jacquet would, or his machine gunner would shoot them down. He would later get 2 more victories in tractor aircraft and would be one of the 5 Belgians who became aces. The other 4 flew fighters, but that's another story. The British also thought that the pusher was the way to go. About July 1915, they introduced the first plane they called a fighter, the Vickers FB-5, which carried a Lewis machine gun on a flexible mounting for the observer while the pilot did the flying. One of the first victories for them occurred in July when Lieutenant Lionel Rees, a Welsh warrior if ever there was one, brought down a Hun and would follow it with 5 more, earning the Military Cross to become one of the earliest British aces. But for him that was only the beginning, as we shall see. At about that same time, the Germans were mounting rear machine guns on their observation planes with a ring mounting developed by a Swiss national named Franz Schneider, who at first had been turned down and had thrown his wooden flexible ring into a garbage heap until High Command reconsidered, at which point he retrieved it, demonstrated it for them, and they were soon being mass-produced for use on aircraft like the Aviatik and the LVG B-2, of which we shall be hearing more. The British, too, however, the Germans now were relying on the observers of their tractor aircraft to use the machine guns, whereas the British were producing another combination. This is another of the FB-2s, but they also produced a more cumbersome pusher machine, the Farman Experimental 2. With a Beardmore engine, it was called the FE-2B, and with a Hispano-Suiza engine, the FE-2D. But in both cases, they had a forward machine gunner with a pilot behind him. It served also as a reconnaissance plane, of course, and as a bomber later in the war, and finished the war out as a night bomber. But it could be used, at least initially, as a fighter. And unlike the FB-5, the British got the idea of dealing with rear attacks by mounting a pole behind the observer later and adding another Lewis gun there, so that if some non-cricket Hun type came up from behind, he could stand up and fire it over the rear wing, which must have taken nerves of steel considering the amount of exposure the poor chap was getting. And I don't just mean to enemy fire, I'm talking about the wind. It's amazing more people didn't fall off the thing. Well, those were some of the two-seater ideas. The Germans at the same time were looking for something more potent, and one of their ideas was to have flying fortresses, the AEG G2, for example, which had twin engines, a pilot, and gunners fore and aft, which would have been a good idea, except that they were too slow to keep out of their own way, and men like Rudolf Berthold, who started out in them, quickly said that they were useless for the purpose of controlling the sky. About that time, it was becoming clear to a number of pilots that the most efficient way to use a machine gun in the air would be to just point the whole aircraft and shoot. Now, this took a bit of evolving, but the first precedent for it, oh, by the way, here is an example of the rear gun, which should give you an idea of what I'm talking about here. And yet they were using those fairly effectively as late as 1917. The French were also producing aces of their own in the form of Adolphe Pégoud, using first pistols and then carbines and then finally a machine gun mounted on a Newport 10 two-seater, which is shown here, as he also speaks with Jean Chaput in this picture. He is the one on the left with the mustache and the grin. By April 1915, he had brought down, and I emphasize not necessarily shot down, but sometimes forced to land or drove down, 5 German aircraft, for which he was called Le Roi du Ciel, and sometimes the term ace or as was bandied about. Well, this was not official, but it later would be. Pégoud, for all intents and purposes, if allowing for the rather lax rules of confirmation, was France's first ace, and he had brought his score up to 6 by April 31st, 1915, when he was shot down and killed in an encounter with a German two-seater, the pilot of which happened to be someone who had learned to fly under his tutelage before the war. One of those many ironies of war. Before World War I, and before the Italians fell under the spell of General Giulio Douhet, who insisted that bombing was the only way to win the war and gave Caproni priority to build bombers. Before that happened, Giovanni Caproni had produced a single-seater mounting a Lewis machine gun on a stick above the framework that held the wires that kept this monoplane stiffened, and also a device that would allow it to be turned from side to side. So he kind of got it and he kind of didn't, but the CA-20 didn't evolve any further, and it would be Italy's fate not to develop anything resembling a usable fighter until well into 1917, except licensed production of French types. It had a lot of potential, but once again it missed a point that was the best way to use any kind of machine gun in the air would be if the pilot could just aim his plane and in so doing aim the gun. But how to do it in a tractor airplane, which predominated? The thing is, you're going to shoot your own propeller off. Well, how do you get around that? Well, you've already seen how the British dealt with it. They put the engine in the back. And the FB-5 made a brief impression on the Germans to the extent that any kind of pusher mounting a gun to the Germans was called a Vickers long after they should have known better. The French, though, had a lot of tractor aircraft like the Nieuport 10. What to do? Well, in the case of the Nieuport 10, well, we'll see what they did with that, but first let's look at another daredevil from the pre-war days. Roland Garros had been studying in Germany when war broke out. The Germans apologetically took him prisoner. Garros, not so apologetically, escaped out from the men's room, ran off to his plane, got it started again, and escaped back to French territory. But he was so angry at the Germans that he wanted revenge. And in April 1915, he found a way. Garros had been very much in the employ of Morand Saulnier, and Robert Saulnier had developed a primitive device for interrupting the propeller whenever it was in front of the machine gun as it was about to fire. But the mechanism didn't work very well. For one thing, it turned out it worked better on, it didn't work as well with open bolt machine guns like the Hotchkiss or the Lewis. And so it would, he also came up with an alternate idea of steel wedges behind the propeller so that if they were hit, they just deflect the bullets. Roland Garros took this a little further by narrowing the propeller where the wedges were so that they could be more acute but also would not, there would be less propeller to hit. This kind of took some of the performance off his plane, but what he was going to adapt a single seat Morand Saulnier N, which both he and his friend Eugène Gilbert had been flying in Austria as early as June 1914. But at the time, the only plane available was a Morand Saulnier L, which is a two-seat parasol reconnaissance plane. He simply turned it into a single-seater, mounted a Hotchkiss machine gun and his wedges, and went looking for trouble. Well, he soon found it. On April 1st, while flying with MS-23 out of Saint-Paul-sur-Mer in the Dunkirk area, he encountered an Albatros two-seater coming head-on. Opened fire at the startled Germans, and down went the Albatros, killing Gefreiter August Spachholz and Lieutenant Walter Grosskopf of Feldfliegerabteilung 40. They had the dubious distinction of being the first victims of a single-seat fighter. Over the next 2 weeks, Garros became the terror of the Western Front, attacking every German plane he could find. He brought down an Aviatik on April 15th, another Albatros 3 days later, but shortly after that, he was forced down in enemy lines, either by an infantryman's rifle bullet through his fuel line, or simple engine trouble, depending on whose story you believe. In any case, he was captured by the Germans. They were delighted to have him, and immediately ordered the wedges to be copied for their own propellers. As Lance will soon be telling you, this didn't cut it with the Germans because, for one thing, the French used copper-jacketed ammunition, whereas the Germans used steel-jacketed ammo, and it would just shatter those wedges if it hit them. One person who recognized this, of course, was Anthony Fokker, but that will be another story that you'll soon be hearing. But meanwhile, on the French side, Morand Saulnier continued to build 49 single-seat Morand Saulnier N's, and among the first to see combat was the one that Garros and Gilbert had flown. Oh, there it is. Gilbert, who was a friend of Garros, added a remark as to his purpose, Le Vengeur, to the side of his, and soon was adding to a score that had begun in a two-seater when he shot down a couple of Germans, the pilot of whom died of his wounds. The observer, who he'd also tended to the wounds of, while waiting to be taken prisoner, remarked to Gilbert that he'd been one of his hugest fans before the war. But Gilbert brought his score up to 5 by the time he was forced down by engine trouble in Swiss territory, interned, later escaped, later was killed in an air crash. Another person who used the deflectors was Jean Navarre, already victor over 2 Germans while flying Morane-Saulnier L2-seaters. He brought down another in July 1915, flying one of the N's, before going on to Nieuport. He, upon scoring his 5th victory, was the first person to be referred to officially by the French as an as, and in so doing establishing the term once and for all for anyone who got 5 or more victories, although the Germans would be slower to adopt the term. They had one of their own. So the French had their deflectors, and it really was a questionable weapon but it did for the time being. The French abandoned it when they came up with something better, as will be described. The British used it much longer than they should have. Number 60 Squadron was fully equipped with Morane-Saulnier N's at first, and later a 110 horsepower up engine version called the I, which one of its members, Willie Fry, said was such a handful to fly with that heavier and more powerful engine that he said it was the only airplane that gave him the impression that it was constantly doing its sincere best to kill him. They really did not do well in the planes and ended up unloading what they had left on the Russians. Ivan Smirnov is known to have scored a victory in one of the Morane-Saulnier I's, but for the most part, that method was a dead end. While the British were playing around with their pushers, Lionel G. Hawker, a captain in number 6 Squadron, happened to remark to his, in a letter home, "I have a beautiful new toy, a new Bristol Scout that goes at 80 and climbs 500 or 600 feet a minute. I'm having a machine gun fitted to see how they like it." This is the machine to which he referred, a Bristol Scout C, whose basic configuration, as a matter of fact, is pretty much the prototype for the most prevalent fighters of World War I. A single bay, wire-braced, fabric-covered biplane with a single seat, originally used for scouting just to get quick over-the-front updates by a single pilot who hopefully would remember what he saw. They called these scouts as opposed to reconnaissance planes. And the term would pervade throughout the war, but in a different context, starting with Hawker. What he had was Air Mechanic Ernest J. Elton, his rigger, rig up a brace so that a single Lewis machine gun could fire down and to the side, clearing the propeller. Elton, by the way, would later become a 16 victory ace himself once he learned to fly and flew Bristol fighters in 1917 to 18. But in the meantime, Hawker went up and on June 21st attacked a DFW 2-seater over Pel-Capel. It was officially credited as brought down out of control. In a forced landing the next day, Hawker overturned his toy, but got a replacement, which is the one shown, number 1611, put his mounting on that. On June 25th, he attacked 3 German 2-seaters, in as many sorties. In his second combat, he forced an Albatros of Fliegerabteilung 3 to land near Passchendaele, and later that day shot down another Fliegerabteilung 3 plane in flames southeast of Zillebeke, killing Oberleutnant Alfred Uberlacher and Hauptmann Hans Roser. Hawker was credited with all three and subsequently awarded the Victoria Cross, the first Brit to receive that for air-to-air combat. Obviously, this was not the sort of weapon that your average pilot could master, and it's not exactly point and shoot. It's a matter of timing and luck, and frankly, Hawker himself would later gain 4 more victories flying FE-2Bs with his squadron. So there was still the question of finding a way to shoot a machine gun straight in line with the plane. Well, the road to that was laid by Nieuport when they, on their Nieuport 10, this is the prototype, and the original concept was at a time when the observer sat up front on many aircraft. He did in the Nieuport. They simply had him stand up through a hole in the upper wing and man a flexibly mounted Hotchkiss machine gun on a flexible mounting. But it was a natural for someone to come up with the idea of mounting it on a fixed framework above the wing and using a Bowden cable to the pilot, allowing him to fire the gun. Nieuport 10s were initially used for this purpose, but about that same time, Nieuport had developed a Scout version in mid-1915. They called it the BB, or in French parlance, Bébé, and given the fact that it looked like it was basically a smaller, nimbler version of the Nieuport 10, it was referred to as the Bébé Nieuport, or baby. It also was given that overwing mounting, except here you had a faster, more nimble plane with a lower wing that only had one spar. It gave better downward visibility for the pilot, and it also endowed the Nieuport with greater maneuverability. It was basically just to allow the bracing of the upper and lower wings so that it was less flimsy than a parasol, which was only wire braced for its monoplane wing. Here you had a sort of a wing, a half a wing. In fact, it was called a 1.5 wing plane, or sesquiplane. And the French would unleash this during the Battle of Verdun, and against what by then had become the Fokker Scourge of the synchronized machine gun Fokker Eindeckers. And it would make a major impression on the Germans. Now here's an example of a Nieuport 11, as they called it officially, with a machine gun mounted above it. And this is also an example of what happened when occasionally fighter met fighter. This particular Nieuport ran into Walter Hündorf, a German Eindecker pilot who got lucky and brought it down and captured the pilot and the plane intact by damaging the engine. It seemed about honors even when these two met, but they didn't meet that often. The Battle of Verdun was not so much a direct duel for air superiority between Nieuport and Eindecker, so much as a duel to see who could shoot down more of the other side's two-seaters, because that was really what it was all about. In fact, by March 1916, when the Germans were denying the French the ability to reconnoiter over the lines thanks to the tactics that were being developed at the time by Hauptmann Oswald Belge, who was using his aircraft more flexibly at the front, but more effectively than the original German strategy of simply having planes up all the time patrolling the lines. Instead, he rigged up telephones to the front line so that if a French plane appeared, they'd call it into his little commando, and he would send his planes right where they were needed. And it was working. At that point, General Henri Philippe Pétain said to the commander of his aircraft in the Verdun area, Commandant Charles de Rose, "Rose, I am blind. Clear the skies for me." Well, he didn't have to tell Rose twice. Rose's answer was to form massed fighter units. In fact, the first single-seat fighter squadron of all time, Escadrille N-12, and unleash his planes en masse at any Germans that showed themselves. Whenever it did come to fighter versus fighter, it was a case of the Nieuport Bebe's superior performance and maneuverability and relatively greater durability against the simple fact that the Fokker Eindecker had a synchronized machine gun where the pilot could just point the plane and fire at his target, whereas the Frenchman had to take into consideration that wherever he fired, the gun was several feet above his head. Another disadvantage of the Nieuport was eventually they did work out a flexible device that allowed it to be pulled back when you ran out of Lewis ammunition so you could replace the drum. But mind you, you're going at 80 miles per hour and the wind is flying at you, and if you're not careful, that drum is going to hit you in the face. And there were other hazards, as Louis Strange in a Martinsyde rigged with a over-wing machine gun that did not have such a device, when he ran out of ammunition in an unsuccessful attack on a German two-seater, he had to stand up and found out that his drum was jammed in the Lewis gun. And he became so obsessed with this that he lost track of the plane under him and it went into a spin. At which point he was praying that that drum remained stuck because that was the only thing that was keeping him from disaster. He kicked around, eventually managed to get his way into the cockpit again, and he landed and found out that he kicked in all of his instruments in the process. When he was criticized for this, I can tell you he didn't give a damn. How you fired the Lewis gun depended on various sites. Jean Chaput's plane, which you saw earlier in color, featured a simple ring suspended between 4 wires that you can just make out under the cabane struts of his Nieuport. This is the one with which he scored his Eindecker victory during the Battle of Verdun. But they did devise something more sophisticated, as shown in this captured Nieuport 16. You can see that they've got a more graduated and systematic ring and bead sight system, as well as a means of pulling the Lewis gun down. It was up to the British, however, to ultimately come up with the Foster mounting, which was a much more flexible and easier to use means of pulling the gun down. And for that matter, the Foster allowed you to fix the gun at certain points if you wished to. And one British Nieuport pilot, Albert Ball, would become rather an expert at attacking Germans from underneath by using his Foster mount to fire the gun obliquely as well as forward. That kind of showboating was, again, something that a skilled enough pilot could do, but hardly the universal panacea. As shown here, Robert Morin had developed a synchronization system for the French, and it was tried on the Nieuport 16, but it didn't work very well. As I mentioned earlier, open bolt machine guns were not very reliable when it came to cooperating with the mechanical interrupter system, and they soon abandoned it until they developed a more efficient system and used it, as the Germans did, with a closed bolt weapon, the Vickers 303-inch machine gun, which became universal for the rest of the war, well, almost the rest of the war for the Allies. During Verdun, though, the Nieuport Bebe reigned supreme. Jean Navarre especially became not only an expert in it, but also through a psychological touch of painting his plane either all red or in red, white, and blue colors, and between shooting down Germans would do aerobatic shows above the trenches to let the French troops know that he was there clearing the sky of the enemy eyes. Navarre was rather an eccentric character who was known to go duck hunting in his plane in between missions and occasionally get lost and have to spend the night in various French towns that by coincidence happened to have one of his lady admirers. He had 12 victories though, and was one of the top aces in the Allied camp when he was wounded in June 1916. At the same time, his brother had been badly wounded in combat, and Navarre was, by that time, a bundle of nerves and had a nervous breakdown that kept him out of the war until practically its end. He became a test pilot thereafter and was killed in an accident. Now, the gentleman here is the one I mentioned earlier, Commandant Charles de Rose, who was well into his 30s when he learned to fly, but by the time of Verdun, he set the example by flying missions himself in a plane with a play on his own name on the side, and he was not credited with any victories, but he certainly inspired his men to be more aggressive, as if they needed that. Unfortunately, and rather wastefully, during a rare case of stunning for a visiting general, Rose was crashed to his death. But by that time, the fighters under his command were quite willing to carry on the fight without him, and were regaining control of the sky. Another French unit that got its start at Verdun was Escadrille 124, whose Bebes were under the command of Captain Georges Thénault. The rest, aside from the executive officer, Delage de Meux, the rest of them were American volunteers trying to convince their country to get into the war. And they would soon gain greater fame later that year when they adopted the name of Escadrille Lafayette. Here's an example. Before that is an example of a Nieuport 16, which had a 110 horsepower engine instead of the 11 Bebes 80 horsepower. This one is flown by Jean Navarre shortly before he was wounded. As with the Morin-Saulnier I, putting in a heavier and more powerful engine in a plane that was doing perfectly well at 80 horsepower made it a handful for any but the most skillful pilots, like a Navarre or a Albert Ball or a Jean Chaput, but a real pain in the hands of others. Willie Coppens, for example, one of the last people to fly one, referred to it as a disagreeable little beast. The French would, by April 1916, have an answer to that by simply increasing the wing area from 13 to 15 square meters in the form of the Nieuport 17, which also featured a synchronized Lewis gun. I stand corrected, Vickers gun, which would be a great improvement and a much better balanced plane to use the 110 horsepower engine. Meanwhile, on the British side, the British persisted in their pusher mentality when Geoffrey de Havilland came out with a single-seater version of his DH-1 two-seater reconnaissance fighter. This one would carry a single Lewis machine gun on a flexible mounting to be used by its pilot. The first one was barely at the front for evaluation when it was shot down by a German two-seater, the pilot of which was Theo Osterkamp, of whom more would later be heard, as the German ace of aces of their naval service with 32 victories. This was his first in a two-seater. The Germans, therefore, immediately knew about the upcoming British single-seat fighter, and yet they still referred to it as a Vickers. The British kept on production of the DH-2, of which this one is shown with number 32 Squadron, but the most influential case was the first squadron equipped with them, and therefore the first British single-seat fighter squadron, number 24 Squadron, under the command of Major Leno G. Hawker. We already know the sort of person he was, and here he really came into his own because the DH-2 had problems. It went into spins easily at a time when no one was sure of how to come out of one, and the machine gun, even while you're fighting such an unstable plane, you're also supposed to use this flexible machine gun. Hawker didn't like that very much. Also, his pilots were suffering from the cold. At high altitude, there wasn't an engine between them and the high altitude freeze. Well, he developed some fleece-lined fug boots, as they were called, which is pilots could pull all the way up as far as they could go. That helped the cold problem. He also devised, being an engineer before the war, he originally wanted to fix the machine gun. He told the RFC that the wobbly mounting was utterly useless. They insisted he keep it, so he devised a clip that would allow it to be fixed in place with the option of taking it out and using the wobbly. Well, the British RFC agreed to that. In theory, therefore, the pilots could have it either way. In practice, Hawker saw to it, and they all agreed, it was not going off that clip. As for the spin, Hawker himself put a DH-4 into a spin in front of all of his men, put all controls central until it stabilized, and then pulled out. And then told them, see, there's nothing to it. And they practiced at it until they mastered it, and another bogey was laid. The DH-2 had its debut in April 1916 and quickly proved to be very successful. There was even a case of two of them bringing down German ace Max Immelmann shortly before his death at the hands of an FE-2B. On July 1st, the DH-2s were the vanguard of British attempts to take control of the air. This is number 24 Squadron, lined up just before the Battle of the Somme. They have a Moran-Saulnier N on hand at the end of the line, but most of them are DH-2s. And as he launched them into combat, Hawker's orders were simple: attack everything. And attack they did. As for 32 Squadron, that was under Major Lionel Rees, who attacked a group of German Walfische on a bombing run, scattered the lot of them, brought down 2 of them before a bullet in his leg forced him out of the fight. That brought his score up to 7, and he also received the Victoria Cross for his actions. As one of his men put it, of course everyone knows the Major's mad. Yet another item that turned up in 1916 was a synchronization device developed by a naval lieutenant, Lieutenant Georgy Lavrov, for what was intended as a 2-seat escort fighter for the Sikorsky Ilya Muromets bombers, the Sikorsky S-16, which mounted a single Vickers synchronized. This is a replica that you can find in New Windsor, Connecticut at the New England Air Museum. That's how and it is based on the 16 flown by the only Russian to score a victory in it. Yuri Gilshuk, flying it alone, shot down an Austro-Hungarian 2-seater over Galicia, and later that same day fell into a spin and was lucky to survive the crash. He had scored the first and only victory for the S-16. As with the Italians, the Russians would mostly make use of French designs for their fighter force. Okay, I'm up to the last. The French, too, had developed synchronization systems. This is one of the best. The SPAD-7, with one developed by the designer of its engine, Mark Birkheit, had a single Vickers. It had a sturdy airframe, and the Hispano-Suiza 8A engine turned it into one of the best serendipitous combinations of airframe, armament, and engine to fly at its time when it debuted in August 1916. Finally, the Allies were getting with the German program, except by then the Germans had aircraft that had 2 machine guns, which tripled the rate of fire, because while one of the propellers was closing a machine gun, the other was out of the way, allowing the other one to fire. And the British also had a synchronization system. Thomas Sopwith developed one in November 1915 for his Sopwith 1.5 strutter, which also featured a flexible Foster mounting, again I correct, scarf mounting for the observer, producing a tractor 2-seat fighter for a brief time anyway, before it would be forced into the recon role by a generation of single-seat tractor fighters, courtesy of Sopwith, starting with the pup. So at that point, the Allies were in the process of catching up with the Germans. When you hear Lance's account, you'll see just what it was they were catching up with. Any questions?
All right, thank you very much.
At what point was it realized that you have to use tracer ammunition? You were describing a lot of these off-axis mounts for machine guns, so in addition to the wind, you've got deflection, and as you said, a little bit of luck as well. So did they start out just using regular ammunition and realize we're not hitting anything, and then move over to tracer, or was it immediate?
It was not immediate. I think it evolved as they went along. I think Lance may be mentioning more on that in future. But by 1917, they were mixing tracer in for the purpose of ascertaining where they were firing. But that was a mixed blessing because they soon discovered that tracer ammunition does not take necessarily the same trajectory as regular bullets, so a lot of people didn't even bother with them.
Thank you. No more questions?
Have we got a good one? I guess I answered them all in advance.
Thank you very much.
Other thing though, for those who are interested in getting this in greater detail, I still have lots of copies of Origin of the Fighter Aircraft, which takes that and beyond to the end of the war, and you'll see how the fighter developed in many different directions once they had the basic formula down. Thank you.